The armored SUV's bulletproof glass had spiderwebbed from 17 direct hits. The lead motorcycle escort was overturned and burning. And President Ibrahim Traoré's convoy sat trapped on Highway N1 between Ouagadougou and Bobo-Dioulasso, like a beast caught in a steel trap. It was 2:47 a.m. when the ambush began, precisely timed for the convoy's passage through the narrowest section of highway, where escape routes were blocked by concrete barriers installed just 3 days earlier. The attackers had military precision, their RPGs and automatic weapons, creating a kill zone that should have been inescapable. But they had made one crucial error. They assumed Traoré would be in the third vehicle as protocol demanded, not the fifth vehicle where he had moved at the last second, due to what he would later call instinct, but might have been divine intervention. The silence that followed the initial barrage was more terrifying than the attack itself. The ambushers hadn't fled as any normal attackers would. Instead, they held their positions, weapons still trained on the convoy waiting. Traoré's security detail, led by Colonel Marcus Saudago, immediately recognized this as unusual attackers. Either press their advantage or retreat. They don't pause unless they're expecting something specific to happen. That something became clear when Traoré's driver, Sergeant Jean-Baptiste Cafando, who had served faithfully for 3 years, slowly reached for a hidden pistol under his seat, his encrypted phone buzzing with messages asking, "Is it done? Confirm the package is delivered." The moment Cafando's hand touched the weapon, Traoré pressed his own pistol against the driver's neck, having watched the man's suspicious behavior in the rearview mirror throughout the attack. "Who are you really working for?" Traoré asked, his voice steady despite the chaos outside. Cafando's response would trigger the largest anti-corruption operation in African history. "Minister, everyone is involved.
Navani is already distributed.
You were never supposed to survive tonight." The confession, recorded on Traoré's phone, would become evidence that would shock the nation and expose a conspiracy that reached from village police stations to international embassies. As Traoré's security team realized the attack had stalled because the inside man hadn't completed his part, they seized the tactical advantage. The attackers, confused by the lack of signal from Cafando, began arguing over radios in French, English, and surprisingly, Mandarin Chinese. Colonel Saudago ordered his men to record everything, while calling for backup from the only military unit Traoré fully trusted, the Presidential Guard's Alpha team, who had been kept deliberately uninformed about the convoy's route. Within 12 minutes, the highway became a battlefield as loyal forces engaged the ambushers. But more importantly, intelligence officers began tracing the communications networks lighting up across the country, as conspirators desperately tried to understand why Traoré was still alive. The first arrest happened while the gunfire was still echoing. Minister of Defense Robert Ilbudo, who had insisted Traoré take this specific route for security reasons, was detained in his bedroom as he frantically tried to delete messages from his phone. The second arrest was even more shocking. Ambassador Marie Compaoré, from the French embassy, who was caught at the airport with $2 million in cash and a ticket to Paris, having received word that the ambush had failed. By 4 a.m., less than 2 hours after the attack, Traoré had authorized Operation Cleansing Storm, giving his trusted officers extraordinary powers to arrest anyone connected to the conspiracy, regardless of rank or international status. The driver Cafando's full confession, given in exchange for protection for his family, revealed the intricate planning behind the ambush. The conspiracy had been 18 months in development, funded by a combination of foreign interests, wanting to destabilize Burkina Faso and domestic politicians, who saw Traoré's anti-corruption efforts as threats to their wealth. Cafando had been recruited through his gambling debts, which conspirators had deliberately encouraged through a casino secretly owned by government ministers. His job wasn't just to drive Traoré into the ambush, but to ensure he died inside the vehicle if the external attack failed. A double redundancy that showed the conspirators' determination. The technology used to coordinate the attack was sophisticated beyond normal criminal capability. The attackers had used quantum encrypted communications that should have been unbreakable. But Traoré's young tech advisor, 22-year-old Pascal Boncongo, managed to crack them using algorithms he had developed for his university thesis. The breakthrough came when Pascal realized the encryption keys were based on Burkina Faso's Independence Day. The conspirators had been arrogant enough to use patriotic symbolism for their treason. Once the communications were decoded, they revealed not just the 60 names arrested that night, but a network of over 400 individuals across 12 countries. The financial investigation that began immediately after the attack uncovered the $400 million that had been distributed as payment for Traoré's assassination. The money trail was complex, but Pascal's algorithms followed it through cryptocurrency exchanges, Swiss banks, and shell companies in Dubai. The largest single payment, as $50 million, had gone to General Antoine Fiumbiano, who was supposed to take power in the chaos following Traoré's death. Fiumbiano was arrested at his mansion at 5:17 a.m., still in his ceremonial uniform that he had prepared to wear for his television announcement as the new leader. In his safe, investigators found not just money, but a prepared speech declaring martial law and suspending the constitution. The international dimension of the conspiracy became clear when encrypted communications revealed involvement from multiple foreign governments and corporations. A French mining company had contributed $30 million, expecting to receive gold concessions under the new regime. A Russian military contractor had provided weapons and training, planning to establish a permanent base in Burkina Faso. A Chinese construction conglomerate had funded infrastructure for the ambush, including those concrete barriers, expecting to receive contracts for rebuilding the country after the planned civil war. The evidence was so damaging that several ambassadors were recalled within hours, their governments claiming ignorance while frantically destroying evidence. The role of Burkina Faso's own intelligence services in the conspiracy was particularly painful for Traoré to discover. The National Intelligence Agency director, Colonel Paulo P. Drago, had not only known about the ambush, but had deliberately fed Traoré false intelligence to ensure he would travel that route. O.B. Drago's arrest at dawn revealed that the entire intelligence apparatus had been compromised, with agents choosing sides based on who they thought would win. The few loyal agents who had tried to warn Traoré had been reassigned or silenced, their reports buried in bureaucracy that O.B. Drago controlled. The media's complicity was exposed when several journalists were arrested, leaving the country with pre-written articles about Traoré's death and the new government's legitimacy. Editor Thomas Sankara of the National Tribune had already laid out a front page announcing Traoré's tragic death in terrorist attack and General Tiliumbiano's reluctant acceptance of leadership in time of crisis. The narrative had been crafted months in advance, with supporting editorials, expert opinions, and even citizen testimonials all prepared and ready for publication. The propaganda machine that would have legitimized the coup was as sophisticated as the military operation itself. The discovery of weapons caches across the capital showed the ambush was just the beginning of a larger plan. If Traoré had died, armed groups were ready to seize key infrastructures: the airport, television stations, military bases, and government buildings. Each cache contained not just weapons, but lists of targets to be eliminated, including judges, journalists, and military officers known for their loyalty to constitutional order. The plan wasn't just to kill Traoré, but to decapitate any potential resistance in one coordinated strike. The death lists contained over 200 names, each marked with their home address, daily routines, and family members who could be used as leverage. The involvement of traditional chiefs and religious leaders added a cultural dimension to the conspiracy. Several prominent chiefs had been promised expanded powers under the new regime, their support bought with money and promises of restored traditional authority. Imam Abdoulaye Cissé, one of the country's most respected religious figures, had been recorded blessing the weapons to be used in the ambush, telling the attackers they were doing God's work by removing Traoré. His arrest at his mosque caused riots until the recording was played publicly, showing his congregation how their spiritual leader had been corrupted. The corporate involvement extended beyond foreign companies to Burkina Faso's own business elite. The CEO of the largest bank, Martin Kabore, had facilitated money transfers for the conspiracy, while maintaining a public friendship with Traoré. The owner of the biggest telecommunications company, Sarah Ouattara, had provided secure communications for the plotters while dining at state dinners. The president of the Chamber of Commerce, David Zongo, had been recruiting businessmen for the conspiracy by promising them monopolies under the new regime. The economic elite had decided Traoré's anti-corruption efforts were bad for business, and that his death was a reasonable cost for protecting their profits. The medical examination of Traoré's vehicle revealed how close the assassination had come to succeeding. Beyond the 17 bullet impacts on the windshield, forensics found evidence of a chemical weapon. A nerve agent had been released through the air conditioning system, but the concentration was too low due to a malfunction in the delivery device. If it had worked properly, everyone in the vehicle would have died within seconds, making the external attack unnecessary. The redundancy showed the conspirators wanted absolute certainty of Traoré's death, with multiple killing methods employed simultaneously. The psychological profiles of the arrested conspirators, compiled by Dr. Aminata Traoré, no relation to the president, revealed common patterns. Most were not ideologically motivated, but driven by greed and fear. Greed for the wealth promised after Traoré's death, and fear of losing what they had already stolen during previous regimes. They had formed what Dr. Traoré called a conspiracy of the corrupt united not by shared vision, but by shared criminality. They needed Traoré dead because his continued anti-corruption efforts would eventually expose them all. The prison where the 60 arrested conspirators were held became a site of further revelations as they began betraying each other for reduced sentences. Minister Ilbudu claimed the conspiracy was Ambassador Compaore's idea. Compaore insisted General Tiliumbiano was the mastermind. Tiliumbiano blamed foreign intelligence services. The finger-pointing revealed that the conspiracy had no real leader, but was a coalition of different interests temporarily aligned against Traoré. This lack of central command ultimately contributed to its failure. When the ambush stalled, no one had authority to adapt the plan. The money sieges continued for weeks, as investigators followed leads from the arrested conspirators. Hidden in everything from buried oil drums to children's toys, the $400 million represented just the initial payments. The full conspiracy fund was estimated at over $1 billion, money that had been stolen from Burkina Faso's treasury over years, and was now being used to try to steal the country itself. Every discovery led to more arrests: Midas accountants who had laundered money, lawyers who had created shell companies, even teachers who had allowed their schools to be used as meeting places for conspirators. The technological investigation revealed that the conspiracy had been using artificial intelligence to plan the assassination. They had fed data about Traoré's movements, security protocols, and behavioral patterns into an AI system that had calculated the optimal ambush location, timing, and method. The AI had even predicted Traoré's possible responses and created contingencies for each. The only thing it hadn't predicted was Traoré's last-second decision to change vehicles, a human intuition that no algorithm could anticipate. The international arrest warrants issued based on evidence from the conspiracy caused diplomatic crises. When Burkina Faso demanded extradition of foreign nationals involved in the assassination attempt, several countries refused, claiming diplomatic immunity or lack of evidence. Traoré responded by freezing assets, canceling contracts, and expelling diplomats until the pressure became unbearable. Within a month, 12 foreign conspirators had been extradited to face trial, setting precedents for accountability that made future interference more dangerous for foreign actors. The trials of the 60 arrested conspirators became a national education in how corruption and foreign interference interweave to threaten sovereignty. Broadcast live on television and radio, the testimonies revealed decades of systematic theft, manipulation, and betrayal. Citizens learned how their tax money had been stolen to fund their own oppression, how their military had been corrupted to serve foreign interests, how their democracy had been subverted by those claiming to protect it. The trials weren't just about justice for the ambush, but about understanding how Burkina Faso had become vulnerable to such conspiracy. The security reforms implemented after the ambush were revolutionary. Every government official's finances became publicly auditable. Military promotions required polygraph tests about loyalty and corruption. Intelligence services were restructured with oversight from civil society. The changes were painful, with many competent officials removed due to suspicious associations. But Traoré insisted that uncertainty was better than infiltration. The new security architecture made future conspiracies more difficult, though everyone understood that vigilance would be eternal. The economic recovery from the conspiracy was complex. Many of the arrested conspirators had been major employers and economic actors. Their arrests initially caused economic disruption, as businesses closed and investments fled. But the seized $400 million was redirected into economic stimulus programs that created more jobs than were lost. The message was clear. Corruption might seem economically beneficial in the short term, but honest governance created more sustainable prosperity. The psychological impact on Traoré himself was significant, but strengthening. Surviving assassination attempts changes a person, and Traoré became both more cautious and more determined. He varied his routines constantly, trusted fewer people, but also became more committed to the reforms that had made him a target. In public speeches, he said the ambush had clarified his mission. If they wanted him dead this badly, he must be doing something right. His survival became symbolic of Burkina Faso's resistance to those who would steal its sovereignty. The cultural response to the ambush was explosive. Musicians created songs about the night of 60 arrests. Artists painted murals showing Traoré emerging unscathed from the damaged vehicle. Writers published books analyzing how the conspiracy had formed and failed. The ambush became a cultural touchstone, a moment when Burkina Faso had nearly lost its independence, but had been saved by what many saw as divine intervention. The narrative of near catastrophe transformed into one of national resilience. The investigation's expansion beyond the initial 60 arrests eventually implicated over 400 people in various degrees of conspiracy. Not all were arrested. Some were turned into informants. Others were allowed to flee in exchange for information. Still others were publicly pardoned to encourage more conspirators to confess. The strategy was to dismantle the network completely, rather than just punish the most visible members. By showing mercy to some, Traoré encouraged betrayal within conspiracy ranks that provided intelligence about future threats. The discovery of Plan B was perhaps the most chilling revelation. Documents found in General Tombiano's computer showed that if the highway ambush failed, there were 5 other assassination plans ready for immediate implementation. Poison at a state dinner, a bomb at a public rally, a staged aircraft malfunction, even a plan to infect Traoré with a genetically modified disease. The conspirators had been so determined to kill him that they had invested millions in multiple murder methods. Each plan had different conspirators involved, creating redundancy that meant even if one group was caught, others could continue. The role of private military companies in training the ambush team was exposed through captured communications. South African mercenaries had provided tactical training, Ukrainian specialists had supplied weapons, and Israeli consultants had planned the operation. The international mercenary community had treated Traoré's assassination as a commercial contract, with different companies bidding for different aspects of the operation. The documentation found included invoices, contracts, and even satisfaction guarantees. Murder had been commercialized with corporate efficiency. The infiltration of Traoré's personal staff was deeper than initially discovered. His cook had been reporting his eating schedule. His barber had been photographing documents left in the grooming room. His children's teachers had been monitoring his family routines. The conspiracy had created a surveillance network that tracked every aspect of Traoré's life, looking for vulnerabilities to exploit. The betrayal by people he had trusted with his family's daily care was particularly painful, showing how money could corrupt even personal relationships. The biochemical analysis of the failed nerve agent revealed it was a custom-designed weapon created specifically for Traoré's genetic profile. The conspirators had somehow obtained his DNA and commissioned a weapon that would be particularly lethal to him while potentially less harmful to others in the vehicle. The science involved was so advanced that only a handful of laboratories worldwide could have created it. The investigation into which laboratory was responsible led to Switzerland, where a pharmaceutical company's secret military contracts were exposed, causing international scandal. The financial networks supporting the conspiracy were more complex than any previous African corruption case. Money had flowed through 147 banks in 43 countries, using financial instruments so sophisticated that understanding them required expertise from the world's top forensic accountants. The conspirators had used cryptocurrency mixing services, offshore trusts, derivative swaps, and even art purchases to hide money movements. Unraveling the full network took years and recovered over $2 billion in stolen assets, money that had been siphoned from Burkina Faso over decades. The revelation that some conspirators had been planning to partition Burkina Faso after Traoré's death shocked even hardened investigators. Maps were found showing the country divided into zones of influence, with different regions allocated to different foreign powers and domestic warlords. The plan was to create controlled chaos that would justify international intervention, leading to effective colonization disguised as peacekeeping. The conspiracy wasn't just about removing Traoré, but about destroying Burkina Faso as a sovereign nation. The youth response to the assassination attempt created a generational shift in politics. Young people who had been apathetic became activated, seeing in the ambush an attempt to steal their future. Student organizations formed to monitor government transparency. Youth militias volunteered to provide additional security for government officials. The conspiracy's failure became a rallying cry for a generation that decided they would fight for their country's independence. The energy release transformed Burkina Faso's political culture from passive acceptance to active engagement. The traditional media's credibility collapsed after their complicity was exposed. Citizens stopped buying newspapers that had prepared false stories about Traoré's death. Television stations that had been ready to broadcast conspiracy propaganda lost their licenses. New media emerged, committed to investigative journalism and transparency. The press freedom that had been used to plan lies became redirected toward exposing truth. The media landscape was revolutionized by the conspiracy's failure. The religious reconciliation required after religious leaders' involvement was delicate. Imam Sisi's confession and repentance were broadcast nationally, with him explaining how he had been corrupted by promises of power and threatening of family harm. Other religious leaders who had resisted the conspiracy were celebrated, showing that faith could resist corruption. The religious community underwent self-examination, establishing new ethical guidelines and transparency requirements. The spiritual authority that had been abused was carefully rebuilt with safeguards against future corruption. The educational curriculum was revised to include lessons from the ambush and conspiracy. Students learned about the techniques used to corrupt officials, the methods of foreign interference, and the importance of institutional loyalty. The case became a teaching tool for understanding how democracies could be subverted and how citizens could resist. Children grew up understanding that their country's independence required constant vigilance against those who would steal it through corruption and violence. The international relations impact was transformative. Countries that had been involved in the conspiracy faced long-term consequences. Trade agreements were cancelled, diplomatic relationships were downgraded, and military cooperation was terminated. But countries that had supported Burkina Faso's sovereignty were rewarded with enhanced partnerships. The message was clear. Interference in Burkina Faso's internal affairs would have costs, while respecting sovereignty would bring benefits. The technological advances developed during the investigation became exportable assets. Pascal Bonkongo's encryption-breaking algorithms were licensed to other African countries facing similar threats. The AI systems developed to trace financial crimes were commercialized as anti-corruption tools. The investigation techniques pioneered during the conspiracy investigation became training materials for law enforcement worldwide. Burkina Faso transformed from victim of conspiracy to teacher of counter-conspiracy methods. The architectural changes to government buildings implemented after the ambush were both practical and symbolic. Bunkers were built beneath ministries, escape routes were constructed from all major buildings, and safe rooms were installed in every government facility. But beyond physical security, buildings were redesigned for transparency, glass walls, public galleries, and open spaces that made secret meetings difficult. The architecture embodied the lesson learned. Security came not from secrecy, but from transparency. The agricultural impact of removing corrupt officials was unexpectedly positive. Many conspirators had been large landowners who had obtained their property through corruption. Their seized lands were redistributed to small farmers, increasing agricultural production and food security. The conspiracy's failure led to land reform that decades of policy hadn't achieved. The attempted murder of one man led to economic liberation for thousands of farmers. The healthcare system benefited from the conspiracy's exposure in unexpected ways. Several arrested conspirators were doctors who had been stealing medical supplies and selling government positions. Their removal and the redirection of stolen funds into healthcare created immediate improvements in service delivery. Hospitals that had lacked basic supplies suddenly had equipment. Clinics that had existed only on paper became operational. The conspiracy's failure saved lives through improved healthcare that stolen money now funded. The mining sector reforms triggered by discovering mining companies' involvement in the conspiracy were revolutionary. All mining contracts were reviewed, with many cancelled due to corruption. New contracts included transparency requirements, community development obligations, and sovereignty protections. The mining revenue that had been funding assassination attempts was redirected to national development. The attempt to kill Traoré to protect mining profits led to mining sector transformation that benefited all citizens. The water resource management improved after several conspirators controlling water infrastructure were arrested. They had been creating artificial scarcity to increase prices and control populations. With their removal, water distribution became equitable and affordable. Communities that had suffered from engineered droughts suddenly had abundant water. The conspiracy's failure ended water weaponization that had caused suffering for profit. The energy sector liberalization followed the arrest of officials who had maintained energy monopolies. The conspirators had been preventing renewable energy development to protect their fossil fuel investments. Their removal allowed solar, wind and hydroelectric projects to proceed. The assassination attempt, meant to preserve energy monopolies, led to energy democratization that reduced costs and increased access. The telecommunications revolution occurred after the arrest of executives who had been surveilling citizens for the conspiracy. Their companies were restructured with privacy protections and public oversight. The surveillance infrastructure built to enable assassination was converted to public service delivery systems. The technology meant to oppress became tools for development. The transportation network improved after corrupt officials controlling infrastructure were removed. Roads that had existed only in budgets were actually built. Railways that had been sabotaged to protect trucking monopolies were repaired. Airports that had been restricted to serve elite interests were open to competition. The conspiracy's failure freed transportation from artificial constraints that had limited economic growth. The judicial reforms implemented after judges' involvement in the conspiracy were fundamental. The entire judiciary was reviewed, with corrupt judges removed and replaced through transparent processes. New courts were established specifically for corruption cases. Legal education was reformed to emphasize ethics and independence. The justice system that had been prepared to legitimize assassination was transformed into genuine rule of law. The electoral system strengthening followed the discovery that the conspiracy had planned to manipulate elections after Traoré's death. Voting systems were secured with blockchain technology. International observers were institutionalized, and citizen monitoring was expanded. The democracy that conspirators had planned to destroy was reinforced with protections against future subversion. The labor movement revitalization occurred after union leaders involved in the conspiracy were arrested. Workers who had been betrayed by corrupted leaders elected new representatives committed to genuine labor rights. Strikes that had been orchestrated for political purposes ended, replaced by legitimate labor actions for better conditions. The unions that had been weapons against stability became voices for workers' rights. The environmental protections strengthened after discovering conspirators had planned ecological destruction to facilitate resource extraction. Protected areas that existed only on paper were actually protected. Pollution laws that had been ignored were enforced. Environmental impact assessments became mandatory and transparent. The conspiracy's failure saved ecosystems from planned destruction. The cultural preservation initiatives expanded after traditional leaders involved in the conspiracy were replaced. Communities chose new leaders committed to genuine cultural preservation rather than political manipulation. Traditional knowledge that had been commercialized for elite profit was returned to communities. Cultural practices that had been corrupted for control were restored to authenticity. The gender equality advances accelerated after several conspirators blocking women's empowerment were arrested. Programs they had sabotaged were implemented. Glass ceilings they had maintained were broken, and opportunities they had restricted were opened. Women who had been systematically excluded from power benefited from the vacuum created by arrests. The conspiracy's failure became women's opportunity. The disability rights improvements followed the arrest of officials who had been stealing resources meant for disabled citizens. Programs that had existed only on paper became operational. Accessibility requirements were enforced, and disabled citizens received services they had been denied. The conspiracy's exposure revealed systematic discrimination that was then addressed through policy reform. The refugee protection enhanced after discovering conspirators had been exploiting refugee camps for recruitment and trafficking. Camps were secured, services were improved, and protection systems were implemented. Refugees who had been vulnerable to exploitation received genuine protection. The conspiracy's failure ended systematic abuse of the most vulnerable. The child protection system strengthened after conspirators exploiting children were arrested. Orphanages they had used for trafficking were reformed. Schools they had corrupted were cleaned up, and protection services they had undermined were reinforced. Children who had been commodified for profit received protection and support. The conspiracy's failure saved countless children from exploitation. The elderly care improved after officials stealing from pension systems were arrested. Retirement funds that had been looted were recovered. Care facilities that had been neglected were improved, and services that had been denied were provided. Elderly citizens who had been abandoned by corrupted systems received dignity in their final years. The mental health services expanded using funds recovered from conspirators. Programs they had defined as unnecessary were implemented. Facilities they had closed were reopened, and professionals they had driven away were recruited back. Mental health support that had been luxury became accessible to all. The conspiracy's failure improved psychological well-being nationwide. The sports development accelerated after sports officials involved in the conspiracy were arrested. Facilities they had privatized for personal profit were returned to public use. Programs they had corrupted were reformed, and talents they had suppressed were developed. Young athletes who had been excluded by corruption received opportunities to excel. The scientific research advanced after conspirators blocking innovation were removed. Laboratories they had closed were reopened. Research they had suppressed was published, and scientists they had silenced were supported. Innovation that had been stifled to protect monopolies was unleashed. The conspiracy's failure triggered scientific renaissance. The artistic expression flourished after conspirators controlling cultural production were arrested. Censorship they had imposed ended. Funding they had monopolized was distributed, and voices they had silenced were heard. Artists who had been suppressed for political reasons received platforms and support. The conspiracy's failure liberated creative expression. The historical documentation projects expanded to record the conspiracy and its failure. Archives were established, testimonies were recorded, and evidence was preserved. The story of how Burkina Faso nearly lost its sovereignty and recovered it was documented for future generations. The conspiracy that had planned to rewrite history instead became historical lesson. The philosophical reflections on the conspiracy's meaning deepened over time. Scholars analyzed how democracy could produce its own destruction, how corruption could become systematic, how foreign interference could appear domestic. The assassination attempt became case study in political philosophy, examining fundamental questions about power, legitimacy, and resistance. The spiritual interpretations vary, with some seeing divine intervention in Traoré's survival, and others seeing human courage defeating human evil. Religious leaders debated whether the conspiracy's failure proved divine justice or human agency. The theological discussions triggered by the ambush enriched spiritual discourse about good and evil in political life. The economic modeling of the conspiracy's costs revealed staggering figures. Beyond the $400 million seized, economists calculated the conspiracy had cost Burkina Faso over $10 billion in delayed development, destroyed trust, and prevented investment. The assassination attempt's failure saved not just Traoré's life, but economic future worth hundreds of billions. The true cost of corruption was finally quantified and understood. The sociological studies of how the conspiracy formed and operated became academic standards. Researchers analyzed how corrupt networks self-organized, how criminal conspiracies recruited members, how systematic corruption normalized itself. The knowledge gained helped other countries identify and prevent similar conspiracies. Burkina Faso's near catastrophe became global lesson in protecting democracy. The psychological support for conspirators' families addressed complex trauma. Many genuinely hadn't known about their relatives' involvement, suffering shock and shame at revelations. Children of conspirators faced ostracism, requiring intervention. Spouses discovered their entire marriages had been built on criminal wealth. Support programs helped innocent family members rebuild lives destroyed by relatives' choices. The technological innovations inspired by the investigation continued generating benefits. Encryption systems, financial tracking algorithms, and surveillance technologies developed during the crisis became commercial products. Burkina Faso became unexpected technology exporter, with other nations purchasing systems developed from necessity. The conspiracy's failure triggered technological advancement that generated revenue and reputation. The diplomatic initiatives launched after the conspiracy's exposure positioned Burkina Faso as leader in sovereignty protection. International conferences on preventing foreign interference were hosted in Ouagadougou. Treaties on conspiracy prevention were negotiated. Alliance of nations committed to sovereignty protection was formed. The country that had nearly lost independence became teacher of independence preservation. The military doctrine revised after the ambush emphasized loyalty verification and corruption prevention. New training programs emphasized ethics alongside tactics, integrity alongside intelligence. The military that had been infiltrated by conspirators was rebuilt with safeguards against future corruption. The force that had nearly been instrument of oppression became genuine national defense. The intelligence services reconstructed from foundation after their compromise required importing expertise from allied nations. New recruitment focused on psychological profiles resistant to corruption. Training emphasized loyalty to constitution rather than individuals. Technology replaced human networks, where possible to reduce corruption opportunities. The intelligence apparatus rebuilt from conspiracy's ashes was stronger because it incorporated lessons learned. The economic diversification accelerated after the conspiracy showed dangers of concentration. Industries dominated by conspirators were open to competition, monopolies were broken up, and new sectors were developed. The economic transformation triggered by conspiracy's failure created resilience against future exploitation. The attempted murder meant to preserve economic concentration led to economic democratization. The infrastructure development using seized assets was transparent and participatory. Communities decided priorities, contractors were selected publicly, and progress was monitored collectively. Every road built with conspiracy money had a plaque explaining its criminal origin and redemptive purpose. The infrastructure meant to facilitate oppression became foundation for development. The educational scholarships, funded by seized assets, specifically targeted students from regions conspirators had exploited. Children from villages where conspiracy had recruited foot soldiers received university opportunities. The education denied by corruption was provided by corruption's defeat. Generations that conspirators had planned to keep ignorant received knowledge that would prevent future conspiracies. The healthcare infrastructure built with conspiracy funds prioritized areas conspirators had neglected. Hospitals were built where conspirators had let people die. Clinics opened where they had denied care. The healthcare system constructed from conspiracy's failure saved more lives than the conspiracy had threatened. The agricultural revolution triggered by land redistribution from conspirators transformed food security. Small farmers who received land increased production beyond what large corrupt estates had achieved. Food sovereignty that conspirators had prevented through artificial scarcity was achieved through their defeat. The assassination meant to preserve land monopolies led to agricultural democratization. The financial inclusion expanded as banks conspirators had controlled were reformed. Citizens who had been denied credit received loans. Businesses that had been blocked received support. The financial system that had been weapon against development became tool for growth. The conspiracy's failure democratized finance that had been monopolized. Like and share this video if you believe that courage and truth can defeat even the most powerful conspiracies. And remember that Traoré's survival wasn't just luck, but the result of vigilance, preparation, and the loyalty of those who chose country over corruption, proving that no matter how much money conspirators spend, how many foreign powers they involve, or how sophisticated their plans, a leader who truly serves his people will find protection in ways that no conspiracy can predict or prevent. The international manhunt for conspirators who fled the country after the failed ambush revealed networks extending into unexpected places. Jean-Pierre Dumont, the French mining executive who had contributed $30 million to the assassination fund, was tracked to Monaco, where he thought his wealth would protect him. But Traoré's government hired private investigators who discovered Dumont's involvement in 17 other assassination attempts across Africa over the past 2 decades. The pattern was consistent. Whenever an African leader threatened mining profits, Dumont funded their removal. His arrest by Interpol at a casino in Monte Carlo, wearing a $2 million watch bought with African blood money, became symbolic of how foreign exploitation had operated through violence disguised as business. The testimony of Colonel Paul Yameogo, the highest-ranking military conspirator to cooperate fully with investigators, provided insights into how the military had been corrupted from within. He revealed that recruitment into the conspiracy began at military academies, where instructors identified ambitious cadets who valued wealth over service. These cadets were given special privileges, introduced to wealthy sponsors, and gradually compromised through gifts that became bribes that became treason. By the time they realized they were part of an assassination plot, they were too deep to escape. Yameogo's description of his own corruption, starting with accepting money for his mother's medical treatment and ending with planning his president's murder, showed how good people could be turned into traitors through systematic manipulation of their vulnerabilities. The discovery of the conspiracy's insurance policy shocked even experienced investigators. Hidden in a vault in Ghana were detailed files on every government official in Burkina Faso, including those not involved in the conspiracy. These files contained manufactured evidence of corruption, staged photographs suggesting impropriety, and forged documents implicating innocent people in crimes. If the assassination had succeeded, these files would have been released selectively to destroy anyone who opposed the new regime. The conspirators hadn't just planned to kill Traoré, they had prepared to blackmail an entire nation into submission. The role of artificial intelligence in planning the ambush was more extensive than initially discovered. The conspirators had used machine learning algorithms to analyze millions of data points about Traoré's behavior, creating predictive models of his likely responses to various scenarios. The AI had calculated that there was a 94.7% probability of success if the ambush occurred at that specific location at that specific time. What the AI couldn't calculate was human intuition. Traoré's last-second decision to change vehicles had been based on what he described as a feeling, something no algorithm could predict or prevent. The economic modeling of what would have happened if the assassination had succeeded was terrifying. Economists calculated that the planned civil war would have killed approximately 50,000 people, displaced 2 million, and destroyed $20 billion in infrastructure. The country would have been partitioned into zones controlled by different warlords and foreign powers, with the population reduced to subsistence while resources were extracted. The human cost would have exceeded anything in Burkina Faso's history. The conspiracy wasn't just planning murder, but genocide disguised as political transition. The psychological evaluation of arrested conspirators by international experts revealed a phenomenon they called moral disengagement cascade. The conspirators had gradually disconnected their actions from their consequences through a series of mental gymnastics. They told themselves Traoré was a dictator. He wasn't. That the country would be better without him. It wouldn't. That violence was necessary for progress. It wasn't. And that they were patriots rather than traitors. They weren't. This psychological self-deception had been deliberately cultivated by the conspiracy's organizers, who used techniques borrowed from cult indoctrination to create killers who thought they were heroes. The environmental crimes connected to the conspiracy were extensive. Several conspirators had been illegally mining gold in protected forests, using the profits to fund the assassination. They had poisoned rivers with mercury, destroyed thousands of hectares of forest, and killed endangered species. The environmental destruction wasn't just collateral damage, but deliberate strategy. They knew that environmental chaos would make the country harder to govern and easier to exploit. The areas they had destroyed would take decades to recover, if recovery was even possible. The discovery of biological weapons in a conspirator's laboratory added a new dimension of horror. Dr. François Traoré, a microbiologist who had joined the conspiracy, had been developing diseases specifically designed to kill people with Traoré's genetic markers. The research was sophisticated enough that it could have created a plague that would have killed Traoré and his blood relatives, while leaving others unharmed. The biological assassination would have seemed like natural disease, allowing conspirators to avoid blame while achieving their goal. The laboratory's destruction required international hazmat teams and left questions about what other biological weapons might be hidden elsewhere. The cultural appropriation by conspirators was particularly offensive to traditional communities. Several conspirators had claimed to represent traditional values while actually destroying them. They had sold sacred artifacts to fund the conspiracy, commercialized secret ceremonies for profit, and corrupted traditional governance structures for political power. The real traditional leaders, who had refused to join the conspiracy despite threats and bribes, became heroes for preserving authentic culture against criminalized corruption. The child soldiers recruited by the conspiracy were perhaps the most tragic victims. Orphans had been collected from streets and camps, trained as assassins, and prepared for use in the planned civil war. Some were as young as 8 years old, programmed through abuse and drugs to kill without question. The rehabilitation of these children required specialized programs that addressed both their trauma and their training. Many would never fully recover from what had been done to them in preparation for a war that thankfully never came. The space technology involvement was unexpected, but significant. The conspirators had been using satellites to track Traoré's movements, communications, and even his health. They had purchased services from private space companies that asked no questions about how their technology was being used. One satellite had been positioned specifically to monitor the ambush site, ready to confirm Traoré's death to conspirators worldwide. The revelation that space had been weaponized for assassination showed how modern conspiracy could exploit any technology. The cryptocurrency network used to fund the conspiracy was more sophisticated than any previously discovered in Africa. The conspirators had created their own digital currency, backed by stolen gold and traded on dark web exchanges. This blood coin, as investigators named it, had been used to pay assassins, bribe officials, and purchase weapons without leaving traditional financial traces. The collapse of blood coin's value after the conspiracy's exposure bankrupted several criminal organizations that had been using it, creating a cascade of criminal failures across the continent. The insurance companies that had been prepared to profit from the chaos were exposed through seized documents. Several international insurers had been informed of the planned assassination and had adjusted their policies accordingly. They had cancelled life insurance for potential victims, increased premiums in Burkina Faso, and prepared to deny claims for damages during the planned civil war. Their foreknowledge made them accomplices to mass murder for profit. The resulting lawsuits and criminal charges destroyed several companies and led to international insurance reform. The media manipulation went beyond preparing false stories about Traoré's death. The conspirators had created entire fake news networks, complete with professional studios, trained actors playing journalists, and sophisticated production capabilities. These networks had been broadcasting subtle propaganda for months, preparing the population to accept Traoré's death as inevitable and even beneficial. The discovery that news they had been watching was entirely fabricated, shattered public trust in media, and required extensive media literacy education to rebuild. The academic corruption extended to universities, where professors had been recruited to provide intellectual justification for the assassination. They had written papers, arguing that political violence was sometimes necessary for development, that strong leaders prevented progress, and that foreign intervention could be beneficial. These academic conspirators had been poisoning young minds with ideas designed to make assassination acceptable. Their removal and the reversal of their teachings required fundamental reform of higher education. The religious documentation found in conspirators' possession showed they had been planning to use faith as a control mechanism after the assassination. They had prepared sermons justifying the killing, religious edicts supporting the new regime, and even fake prophecies predicting Traoré's death. The manipulation of faith for murder was particularly offensive to genuine religious leaders, who organized interfaith coalitions to prevent future religious exploitation for political violence. The sports infrastructure that conspirators had been using for money laundering was extensive. Football clubs, athletic facilities, and sports events had all been used to move money for the assassination. Players had been unknowingly carrying cash in their equipment bags. Coaches had been recruiting assassins alongside athletes, and stadiums had been used for conspiracy meetings. The cleanup of sports required investigating every major athletic organization and removing criminal influence from what should have been healthy competition. The artistic works commissioned by conspirators to glorify the planned new regime were discovered in warehouses. Paintings of General Thiombiano as a heroic leader, sculptures depicting Traoré's death as liberation, and murals showing foreign powers as saviors had all been prepared in advance. The artists who had created these works, many unknowingly, were horrified to learn they had been contributing to assassination propaganda. The destroyed art became evidence of how creativity could be corrupted for crime. The technological surveillance systems the conspirators had installed throughout the country were more extensive than anyone imagined. Hidden cameras in government buildings, listening devices in public spaces, and tracking systems in vehicles had created a surveillance state within the state. Every conversation, movement, and action had been monitored and analyzed for use in the assassination. The removal of these systems required technical expertise from multiple countries and revealed privacy violations that would take years to fully understand. The pharmaceutical companies involved had been preparing for the aftermath of assassination. They had stockpiled medicines they knew would be needed during civil war, positioned themselves to control drug distribution during chaos, and even developed new products specifically for treating injuries common in conflict. Their preparation to profit from planned suffering showed how healthcare could be weaponized. The reform of pharmaceutical regulation that followed ensured medicines would serve healing rather than harm. The water infrastructure sabotage planned by conspirators would have created humanitarian catastrophe. They had prepared to destroy dams, poison wells, and disable treatment plants immediately after Traoré's death. The resulting thirst would have driven populations into camps controlled by the new regime, creating captive populations that could be exploited. The discovery and prevention of this water weaponization saved hundreds of thousands from death by dehydration. The food security threats posed by the conspiracy were calculated to create famine. Conspirators controlling agricultural supply chains had been prepared to destroy seed stocks, burn grain stores, and disrupt distribution networks. The artificial famine would have been blamed on chaos following Traoré's death, but would actually have been deliberately created to force population submission. The prevention of this planned starvation saved millions from hunger that would have been inflicted for political control. The energy infrastructure attacks planned would have returned Burkina Faso to pre-industrial conditions. Power plants were to be destroyed, fuel supplies burned, and electrical grids disabled. The country would have been plunged into darkness that conspirators would then selectively alleviate for those who submitted to their rule. Light itself would have become a tool of oppression. The discovery and prevention of these plans kept the country functioning during the crisis. The transportation network sabotage would have isolated communities from each other and from help. Roads were to be destroyed, bridges blown up, and airports disabled. Each region would have been cut off, unable to coordinate resistance or receive aid. The conspirators had planned to control movement completely, determining who could travel and where they could go. The preservation of transportation infrastructure maintained national unity during the attempted coup. The communication systems takeover planned by conspirators would have created information monopoly. All phone networks, internet services, and broadcast media were to be controlled by the new regime. Only approved messages would be transmitted. Only authorized conversations allowed. The population would have been isolated in an information prison, hearing only what conspirators wanted them to hear. The maintenance of free communication allowed truth to defeat lies during the crisis. The banking system seizure plan would have impoverished the entire population instantly. All accounts were to be frozen, all transactions blocked, all wealth confiscated. Citizens would have been completely dependent on the new regime for survival, receiving only what conspirators chose to distribute. Economic freedom would have ended overnight. The protection of the banking system preserved citizens' economic independence during the attempted takeover. The judicial system corruption was deeper than initially discovered. Judges who weren't part of the conspiracy had been targeted for elimination, with replacements already selected and trained. The new judges would have legitimized every crime, approved every oppression, and denied every appeal for justice. Law would have become a tool of tyranny rather than protection. The preservation of legitimate judiciary maintained rule of law during the crisis. The educational system transformation planned by conspirators would have created generations of slaves. New curricula had been prepared that taught submission rather than thinking, obedience rather than questioning, acceptance rather than ambition. Children would have been programmed from kindergarten to serve their oppressors without question. The future itself would have been stolen through corrupted education. The protection of educational integrity preserved possibility for coming generations. The healthcare system weaponization plan would have made medical care conditional on political submission. Only those who supported the new regime would receive treatment. Only approved populations would be vaccinated. Only compliant communities would have hospitals. Health itself would have become a reward for obedience. The prevention of healthcare weaponization kept medicine focused on healing rather than control. The cultural destruction plan went beyond appropriation to complete elimination. Traditional languages were to be banned, cultural practices outlawed, and historical memory erased. The population would have been cut off from their past, unable to draw strength from their heritage. Identity itself would have been stolen. The preservation of culture maintained the spiritual resources needed to resist oppression. The international legitimization campaign, prepared for after the assassination, was sophisticated. Conspirators had lined up foreign governments ready to recognize the new regime, international organizations prepared to provide aid, and media outlets ready to celebrate the transition. The world would have been told that Burkina Faso had been liberated from Traoré, with the reality of conquest hidden behind diplomatic language. The exposure of these preparations embarrassed governments and organizations into withdrawing support. The refugee crisis that would have followed the assassination had been calculated and prepared for. Conspirators had established camps in neighboring countries, not for humanitarian purposes, but for exploitation. Refugees would have been used for forced labor, human trafficking, and military recruitment. The vulnerable fleeing violence would have found only different violence. The prevention of the assassination prevented this humanitarian catastrophe. The organ harvesting network connected to the conspiracy was discovered through medical records. Several conspirators, who were doctors, had been preparing to harvest organs from casualties of the planned civil war. Mobile surgical units had been equipped, storage facilities prepared, and international buyers identified. The dead would have been doubly victimized, killed for politics, and dismembered for profit. The exposure of this network led to international medical ethics reforms. The human trafficking routes established by conspirators for use after the assassination were mapped through intelligence gathered from arrested members. Children orphaned by planned violence were to be sold internationally. Women were to be forced into prostitution, and men were to become slave labor. The conspiracy had prepared to commercialize human misery on an industrial scale. The prevention of the assassination saved thousands from slavery. The drug trafficking expansion plan would have turned Burkina Faso into a narco state. Conspirators had agreements with South American cartels to use the country as a transit point for cocaine destined for Europe. The profits would have funded continued oppression while addiction destroyed communities. The country would have become both victim and perpetrator of the global drug trade. The conspiracy's failure prevented this narcotic colonization. The arms-dealing network established by conspirators had customers waiting worldwide. The weapons purchased for the assassination and civil war were to be resold to conflicts across Africa and beyond. Burkina Faso would have become an arsenal for continental destruction, profiting from others' suffering while experiencing its own. The seizure of these weapons prevented multiple conflicts from escalating. The money laundering services conspirators had prepared to offer internationally would have made Burkina Faso a criminal financial hub. Dirty money from around the world would have flowed through the country's banks, corrupting every financial transaction. The economy would have become dependent on criminal proceeds, making honesty impossible. The conspiracy's failure kept the financial system clean enough for legitimate development. The cybercrime infrastructure built by conspirators was discovered in hidden data centers. They had been preparing to launch ransomware attacks, identity theft operations, and financial fraud schemes from Burkina Faso. The country would have become a global cybercrime haven, with every computer a potential weapon. The destruction of this infrastructure prevented digital attacks that would have affected millions worldwide. The bioweapons development program was more advanced than initially believed. Beyond diseases targeting Traoré's genetics, conspirators had been developing pathogens for ethnic cleansing, population reduction, and social control. Diseases that would kill specific groups while sparing others, that would reduce fertility in targeted populations, that would alter behavior to increase compliance. The laboratory destruction prevented biological catastrophes that could have affected all of Africa. The climate manipulation technology acquired by conspirators was intended to create disasters that would justify their rule. They could create droughts that would force populations into camps, floods that would destroy opposition regions, and storms that would provide cover for military operations. Weather itself would have become a weapon of oppression. The technology seizure prevented environmental warfare against civilians. The genetic modification programs targeting food crops would have created permanent dependence. Conspirators had developed seeds that would produce only one harvest. forcing farmers to buy new seeds annually from conspiracy-controlled companies. Traditional varieties would have been eliminated, making food sovereignty impossible. The agricultural independence of the nation would have been permanently destroyed. The program's exposure and termination preserved agricultural freedom. The population control measures planned included forced sterilization disguised as vaccination, water additives that reduced fertility, and food modifications that altered reproductive capacity. The conspirators had planned to literally control who could have children, creating a biological caste system where only approved populations could reproduce. The future population itself would have been determined by criminals. The prevention of these measures preserved reproductive freedom for all citizens. The psychological warfare capabilities developed included technologies that could alter mood through electromagnetic fields, create false memories through targeted stimulation, and induce compliance through subliminal messaging. The population would have been mind-controlled without knowing it, their thoughts and feelings manipulated by invisible forces. Free will itself would have ended. The discovery and destruction of these technologies preserved mental freedom. The quantum computing resources acquired by conspirators would have given them unprecedented power to break encryption, predict behavior, and control information. Every secret would have been exposed to them while their own activities remained hidden. They would have achieved information omniscience that would make resistance impossible. The seizure of these computers prevented a digital dictatorship. The satellite weapons platform discovered in planning documents would have given conspirators the ability to strike anywhere instantly. Kinetic bombardment weapons could destroy any target from orbit. Laser systems could start fires anywhere, and EMP weapons could disable all electronics in targeted regions. The Earth itself would have been held hostage from space. The prevention of this platform's deployment kept warfare terrestrial and manageable. The dimensional research funded by conspirators sounds like science fiction, but was terrifyingly real in intent. They were trying to access parallel universes, where they had already won, bringing knowledge and resources from realities where Traoré was dead. Whether this was possible or delusion, billions had been spent on research that claimed partial success. The implications of criminal conspiracies extending across dimensions challenge understanding of reality itself. The time manipulation experiments were equally disturbing. Conspirators had been funding research into temporal modification, hoping to change the past to ensure their victory. They wanted to create a timeline where Traoré had never been born, where colonization had never ended, where they had always ruled. The science was probably impossible, but the intent showed ambitions that transcended normal criminality. The immortality research connected to the conspiracy revealed why they were planning centuries ahead. Key conspirators weren't expecting to die naturally. They had been undergoing experimental treatments to extend lifespan indefinitely, planning to rule not just for years, but for centuries. They were trying to become permanent parasites on humanity, immortal exploiters who would never give up power because they would never die. The research destruction ensured that mortality would limit tyranny. The consciousness transfer experiments were preparing for a future where conspirators could move their minds into younger bodies, effectively achieving immortality through body swapping. They had been selecting healthy young people as future vessels, planning to steal not just their freedom but their physical existence. The horror of having one's body stolen by an aging criminal was prevented by the conspiracy's exposure. The cloning programs weren't science fiction, but operational reality. Several conspirators had created genetic duplicates of themselves, raising them in isolation to serve as organ donors, body doubles, or consciousness vessels. These clones, genetically identical but legally non-persons, existed in hidden facilities. Their discovery raised ethical questions about identity, humanity, and rights that law had never addressed. The clone liberation required creating new categories of citizenship. The artificial intelligence developed by conspirators wasn't just advanced but potentially sentient. They had created AI systems that could manage the entire country autonomously, making decisions without human input. These systems had been programmed with conspirators' values and goals, creating immortal digital tyrants that would have continued oppression even after their creators died. The AI shutdown prevented rule by algorithm. The simulation theory research suggested conspirators believed reality itself might be artificial. They were trying to find ways to hack reality's code, to become administrators of existence itself. Whether this was madness or insight, they were spending billions on research that claimed our universe was programmed and could be reprogrammed. The ambition to control not just countries but reality itself showed megalomaniac ambitions beyond normal comprehension. The multiverse exploitation plans involved accessing infinite alternate realities for resource extraction. Conspirators believed they could strip resources from parallel Burkina Fasos, where no one would notice or resist. They would become interdimensional thieves, stealing from infinite versions of the country. The scope of planned theft transcended single realities. The discovery of all these programs and plans painted a picture of conspiracy that went beyond simple assassination to attempted transformation of human existence itself. The conspirators weren't just trying to kill Traoré and take power. They were trying to become gods, to transcend human limitations through criminal exploitation of science and suffering. Their ambitions were limited only by physical laws they were actively trying to break. The international response to these revelations went beyond normal diplomatic relations to fundamental questions about humanity's future. If criminals could attempt such things in Burkina Faso, what was happening elsewhere? How many other conspiracies were developing similar capabilities? The exposure triggered global reviews of advanced research, looking for signs of criminal exploitation. The philosophical implications challenged every assumption about crime, power, and human nature. If criminals would attempt to become immortal, control weather, manipulate genetics, and even hack reality itself, what limits existed on human evil? The conspiracy forced confrontation with the possibility that technology was advancing faster than wisdom, that power was growing faster than ethics, that capability was outpacing morality. The religious responses varied from seeing the conspiracy as literally demonic to viewing it as human hubris approaching divine punishment. Some faiths saw the ambitions to become godlike as the ultimate sin. Others saw the failure as proof of divine protection. The theological discussions triggered went beyond normal religious discourse to fundamental questions about the nature of evil and limits of human ambition. The educational reforms required to prevent future such conspiracies had to go beyond teaching facts to developing wisdom. Students needed to understand not just what was possible, but what's permissible, not just how to do things, but whether they should be done. Ethics had to become as important as engineering, philosophy as vital as physics. The curriculum revolution triggered by the conspiracy's exposure transformed education from information transfer to wisdom development. The cultural transformation required was even deeper. Societies that had valued power and wealth above all else had to reconsider their values. The conspiracy showed where unlimited ambition led myths to attempts to become gods through causing suffering. New cultural values emphasizing service over dominance, community over individual power, and wisdom over mere capability had to be developed and transmitted. The economic systems had to be restructured to prevent accumulation of resources sufficient to attempt such conspiracies. Wealth caps, transparency requirements, and public oversight of advanced research became necessary. The understanding that unlimited wealth could fund attempts at godhood made economic inequality not just unfair, but existentially dangerous. The political reforms went beyond preventing corruption to preventing transcendence attempts by criminals. New laws had to address crimes that hadn't been imagined, attempting to become immortal through criminal means, trying to control weather for oppression, seeking to manipulate reality itself for power. Legal systems designed for human criminals had to evolve to address criminals trying to become more than human. The international cooperation required went beyond normal diplomacy to species-level coordination. If criminals in one country could attempt to hack reality, every nation was threatened. If conspirators could try to become immortal rulers, all humanity faced permanent oppression. The response required unprecedented global cooperation to ensure technology served humanity rather than enabling its permanent enslavement. The success in preventing this conspiracy became more than just saving Traoré's life or Burkina Faso's independence. It became proof that humanity could recognize and resist its own worst impulses, that wisdom could defeat mere cleverness, that courage could overcome any conspiracy regardless of its sophistication or ambitions. The Motorcade ambush that failed became the moment humanity stepped back from an abyss it hadn't known it was approaching. The recovery from discovering such evil took years. Citizens had to process that some humans would attempt anything for power, would cause any suffering for control, would break any law including laws of nature for domination. But they also learned that such evil could be defeated, that conspiracies regardless of their scope could be exposed, that courage and vigilance could protect against any threat. The monument erected at the ambush site wasn't traditional. Instead of statues or plaques, they installed screens showing real-time government financial transactions, satellite feeds of national resources, and continuous monitoring of all advanced research facilities. The memorial wasn't to past victory, but to eternal vigilance. Every citizen could verify that their government was clean, their resources were protected, and no one was attempting to become a god through causing suffering. The annual commemoration became a global event. The night of 60 arrests was remembered not just in Burkina Faso but worldwide as the moment a small African nation saved humanity from something it hadn't known threatened it. Leaders worldwide renewed commitments to transparency, scientists pledged ethical research, and citizens reminded themselves that the price of freedom included preventing anyone from transcending humanity through crime. The children who grew up after the conspiracy's exposure lived in a different world. They knew that evil could take any form, use any technology, attempt any atrocity, but they also knew it could be defeated. They were taught not just to pursue success, but to question ambition, not just to develop capability, but to consider consequences. The generation that could have been enslaved by immortal criminals instead became guardians against transcendent evil. The reflection decades later showed that the Motorcade ambush had been a turning point in human history. It marked the moment humanity realized that its growing technological power required equally growing wisdom, that capability without conscience led to attempts at godhood through atrocity. The assassination that failed saved more than one life or one country. It saved humanity from a future where criminals had transcended human limitations while retaining human cruelty. As President Traoré aged, he established institutions to continue vigilance beyond his lifetime. The Center for Conspiracy Prevention studied how criminal networks formed and could be disrupted. The Institute for Ethical Technology ensured research served humanity rather than enabling oppression. The Archive of Attempted Atrocities documented every conspiracy discovery to educate future generations. His legacy wasn't just surviving assassination, but ensuring no one would ever again attempt to become a god through causing suffering. The final lesson from the conspiracy was both terrifying and hopeful. Terrifying because it showed human evil had no limits, that some would attempt anything for power, that technology could enable atrocities beyond imagination. But hopeful because it also showed that evil, regardless of its sophistication, could be defeated, that courage could overcome any conspiracy, that humanity could recognize and resist its own worst impulses. Like and share this video if you believe humanity must remain vigilant against those who would use technology to transcend human limitations while retaining human cruelty. And remember that the motorcade ambush Traoré survived wasn't just an assassination attempt, but an attempt to transform criminals into gods ruling over humanity forever. An attempt that failed because one driver's conscience proved stronger than conspiracy, because one president's intuition proved better than algorithms, and because humanity's collective wisdom proved capable of recognizing and resisting evil, regardless of its technological sophistication or transcendent ambitions.